train with receiving the initiating signal and unlocking the train. And that's why I call them a long unlocking arm and the short unlocking arm. The third arm that comes from there reaches across the train, usually up a little high, reaches up usually to the highest wheel in the train. And that wheel in the train will have, in its simplest form, will have a pin on it, which I will call the warning pin, and that wheel I'm going to call the warning wheel, because that's what they call it if it's involved with the warning. And this arm I will call the warning detent. It reaches across to this wheel, but doesn't cover the wheel quietly. It doesn't quite reach up to where the wheel reaches. Let me show you now how this entire mechanism works from its beginning, the usual sequence of events that take place. So I'll back this up and I'll let a little bit more striking take place. And we'll go through that series of things that it does to show you the entire sequence. When the minute hand rotates and reaches the point where it's about, maybe 10 minutes before the hour, the finger on the center arbor pushes against the long unlocking arm, causing the unlocking warning assembly to rotate. See? That's the only thing that's moved so far. Causes the unlocking warning assembly to rotate. And the first thing that happens, and it's important that the first thing that happens is the following. The warning detent is lifted into the path of the warning pin. That is, if the warning pin is going to run, this warning detent is now in the path of that warning pin. Nothing's happened. Nothing beyond that. As the minute hand moves further, it continues to rotate the unlocking warning assembly, and the short unlocking arm, because of its position and where it's located, will push against one of the arms of the counting locking assembly. You see right away this approach to it is something which you will not see. I've not seen it elsewhere or heard it used. I consider it very important. Perhaps shortly you'll understand why. Okay, so the minute hand, as it rotates further, causing the unlocking warning assembly to rotate further, the short unlocking arm pushes against one of the arms of the counting locking assembly, and at some point, maybe 5 minutes to the hour or so, it unlocks the train. And the train starts to run. This makes that in an instant. It makes it high in the train. It takes an instant to make that run. And it's stopped by the warning detent. This, being lower in the train, won't move halfway around that way, but will move perhaps that far. And the count wheel will move, well, maybe that far. And some count wheels might not even move at all if it's way down at the bottom, much slower moving. The train is unlocked, but it cannot strike. It cannot strike because the warning detent is holding the warning pin. But the train is unlocked. I told you the minute this is out of the slot, it's unlocked. Now, in the next 5 minutes or so, as the minute hand reaches the 12, the long unlocking arm drops off the finger on the center arbor, allowing the warning detent to drop away from the warning pin, the warning detent to drop away from the warning pin. And now this mechanism can perform its function as I described to you before, determining how long it shall run, thereby the number of strikes that take place, and preventing, keep that always the two functions of mine, and preventing locking from taking place until that time. Now let me show you what happens if there's no warning. Because as I told you, everybody knows what the warning does. That's what it does. But I'm not sure everybody understands why the warning is necessary. Look what happens if you don't have a warning. We'll set everything back the way it was, and we'll disregard that arm. It's not there. Everything else is as you saw it before. Now, minute hand comes around, the finger on the center arbor pushes against the long unlocking arm, causing the unlocking warning assembly to rotate. And as it moves to a certain point, remember this is not there, moves to a certain point, the train is unlocked. And it starts to strike. Okay? You get one strike, and this moves a little bit, as I said. And this continues to run because there's no deep slot, and another strike takes place, and another strike takes place, and and another strike takes place. And of course, when this comes around, another strike takes place. It won't lock. Why won't it lock? Because the minute hand, moving very slowly, is going to keep that train unlocked for the full 5 minutes or so until it reaches the 12 and the long unlocking arm drops away from the finger on the center arbor, allowing this mechanism now to work as I explained to you before. So now you know why the warning is necessary. This question is always on the exam. That's what I say in school. And as a matter of fact, usually two fellows who are sitting in the front who came there to take the course together, and one looks at the other and he says, exam? What exam? He didn't say anything about exam. There's no exam. There's no exam, I assure him. But it just means that I use this device to tell you that here's something very important. This is the question that's always on the exam, if there were an exam. Why is the warning necessary in all the clocks that we see practically? And you know the reason. It's necessary because the initiating signal comes from a slow-moving device which will unlock the train and keep it unlocked for at least 5 minutes until it reaches the 12 and the long unlocking arm drops off the finger. Well, you know the rest of it, okay? That's why it's necessary. Well, this is a two-part question. Okay, now you know why the warning is necessary. Under what circumstances is the warning not necessary? Well, it wouldn't be necessary if instead of it being a slow-moving device, it were a fast-moving device. If that moved very fast, it wouldn't have a chance to strike for a long period of time. And I explain this slow-moving device so that you don't have a warning like that one. I explain that it's as though the train, when it's running, is drawing a bow and arrow. And as the minute hand reaches the 12, when the minute hand reaches the 12, what happens is that arrow is released, and you know what it does? Flick, just like that. In one shot, it unlocks the train, steps back out of the way. You don't need a warning. You don't need a warning if you have that fast act. That quick flick like that I describe as drawing a bow and arrow and releasing the arrow. It's called flirt action or knockout action. Now, where did he get the term flirt? This is what I read somewhere. I didn't make it up. If a lady winks at you across a crowded room, quick wink like that, she's called a flirt. And the flirt is so called because the wink only takes an instant, and that's why this quick action is called flirt action, or it's called knockout action. Somehow I like the term flirt action better because she winks at you across a crowded room. Okay. All right, fine. Now, now you know the reason why the warning is needed and under what circumstances it is not needed. But those circumstances on which it may not occur, which it doesn't be there, where there doesn't be a warning, that we haven't gotten to. And you'll see it a little bit later. It's on that clock over there where you can understand how it works. All right, let me make sure I don't leave anything out here, because the sequence is important. I sometimes leave things out, the simplest form. Right, okay. I knew this is something that I often leave out because it somehow doesn't fit. Resynchronizing count wheel striking. And everybody knows how to resynchronize. You turn the hands round and round, or you take the hour hand, you move it. There is a very simple way of advancing the striking in every count wheel striking mechanism, no matter where you find it, without changing the position of the hour hand. And the reason it comes to my mind is because I will tell you that Lord Grimthorpe didn't know. You know who Lord Grimthorpe was? He's the gentleman who invented the double three-legged gravity escapement that you have in the clock in the Houses of Parliament, you know, that strikes the bell, called Big Ben. In a treatise that he wrote, Very interesting, marvelous. Everybody knows it. Everybody should have a copy of it, at least one copy at home. He says that he's annoyed with American clocks and French clocks because if one train stops running before the other, or the clock is moved sometimes, or you're just winding, they'll get out of synchronization. And it's a very annoying thing to have those turn those hands round and round and round and round to get it back into synchronization. So he didn't know this, which is a great surprise to me, because practically everybody else does. But for those who may not know it, not everyone does know it, there's a very simple way of advancing the striking in any place you see count wheel striking. And this is what you do. Just to get this thing onto the warning again, this comes around, and what you do is you move the minute hand until it's a few minutes to the hour. Don't move it to the 12 or past the 12. Just move it until you hear the warning. Then all you need to do, what has happened, if you hear the warning, this has moved this far, this has moved this far as I showed, this has moved this far, clock is unlocked, but it isn't striking, and it isn't going to strike the next hour. Now just take the minute hand and move it back to the 9. Move it back to the 9. What do you see happening up here? The warning is released. So without making any changes in the time train over here, you are allowing the clock to strike the next in sequence, and you've made no change in the position of the hands. Sometimes, depending upon when the clock strikes and what the synchronization that's out of synchronization is, that will avoid a great deal of turning the hands round and round. You can do that as often as you need. You just, when you've done that, what you do is you move it back up again. The clock will go on the warning again, and all you have to do is move the minute hand back, release the warning, it'll strike the next in sequence. You can do that repeatedly. And I just thought I'd mention, because it's not a big deal, but it's something which not everybody appears to know. So that's how you resynchronize count wheel striking if you want. Now, let's get to the variations, because as I said, this is count wheel striking in simplest form, but the variations are very important. In a minute, you'll see why. First variation that occurs, it's so simple that you're going to think, well, why even bother mentioning it? It seems almost trivial. The first common variation that I always list first is this. Sometimes, pretty often, as a matter of fact, sometimes the short unlocking arm is not on the unlocking warning assembly, but it's on the counting locking assembly, and shaped in such a way that when the finger on the center arbor pushes against the long unlocking arm, that long unlocking arm will push against the short unlocking arm, causing this to unlock. I mean, nothing complicated about that. It seems trivial. Why do I mention it? Tell you why I mentioned it, and this is where I'm getting to what I've been talking about. Every French count wheel striking clock you will ever see, forever, has the short unlocking arm not on the unlocking warning assembly, but on the counting locking assembly. Every one. I surely don't know any exceptions. Now, isn't that strange? I'm talking about American count wheel striking, and here is one of the simple variations. And I'm also explaining how French count wheel striking works. This is why I consider it one of the variations. I never forget to mention it, and I'm always tickled to say that every French count wheel striking clock will have that minor variations, every one. Okay, second variation. This one's very common. In fact, probably most of the clocks that you see are this. Somewhere along the line, the clockmaker or clockmakers decided they wanted this count wheel not to be firmly fixed and carried around on one of the arbors in the train. They wanted to move independently of that arbor. Well, if it's fixed on the arbor turns, that's what turns it. But if it wanted to be moved independent of that arbor, how can you do it? Easy enough. You put teeth on this smooth rim count wheel, and you drive it with a pinion on the adjoining train. As I told you, all the other wheels are not there, but there's another. They can be placed anywhere the guy who designs the clock wants to do it. And on the pinion and on the arbor that's right nearby, you put a regular pinion on it, and you drive this new count wheel that has teeth on it. Take me a second, and we'll put teeth on that count wheel. Okay, now we have a toothed count wheel, and we can drive it with a regular pinion, a cut pinion on this arbor over there. As a matter of fact, sometimes it isn't even being driven by a regular cut pinion, or it's being driven by a pinion, you might say, with only one leaf. More commonly, you will see it in this form. Can I tell you? How about a sidebar? You know, a sidebar, it's got nothing to do with what I'm talking about. Every time I make this drawing on the board, I think of the time when I first started to work on clocks, and I had the feeling somehow there was a difference between American clocks and all other clocks. I didn't know what it was. Seriously, for a long period of time, I couldn't put my finger on it, until I realized that right in here, there is a fundamental difference between American clocks. I almost said un-American clocks. I don't mean that at all. Between American clocks and all clocks that are not made on the American style. Okay? The only fundamental difference. This is it. I'll tell you in a minute what it is. It's this. That in American clocks, oh boy, do I knock things over. In American clocks, the gear that is on the arbor that turns the minute hand, that gear is driven by one of the wheels in this powertrain over here, in American clocks. In all the other clocks not made on the American style, that gear that's over here along the arbor is in fact one of the wheels in the powertrain, so that the power goes from here to here to here to here to here. But that only is so in clocks that are not made on the American style. And there's a reason for it. I don't want to get into it because this is just a sidebar. See me later, and I'll explain to you why that one fundamental difference between American clocks and all others. And now, where was I when I stopped? I always managed to stop at a place I can't remember where I ended. What was I talking about? Where I got to this thing. I beg pardon?
Teeth on the count wheel.
Teeth on the. Thank you. I'm glad. Thank you for paying attention. It's good to get a good mark on that one. Okay, we have a tooth count wheel now. And I'm driving it, I said, it can be driven by a regular pinion. Or in many cases, I'm going to draw, that's when I reached back to this to look at it and I saw this space was empty. Let me show you what you very often find. It's a very common variation. Let me draw, well, okay, this is, let's call that, this is the count wheel with regular teeth. That was a great regular teeth. Henry Freed saw me do this, he would give me hell. There was a fellow who could stand up at the board, and he would very quickly draw things that looked like something out of W.L. Goodrich, the modern clock, you know, everything just perfectly. But nobody duplicates what he can do. However, sometimes it's being the tooth count wheel is being driven not by a regular pinion, but by a lantern pinion. You can imagine a lantern pinion over here, and this is the shroud of the lantern pinion, and there's one of the trundle wires. I remember trundle wires. It's a hard word for me to remember. One of the trundle wires projecting out of the shroud of the lantern pinion, and that's going to drive this count wheel in this direction. by moving down in between the teeth and pushing against the next tooth and moving it and pushing against the next. But it's going to bunk into the top of the tooth over here. So what do? Easy enough. You cut away this part. You cut away each of the teeth in such a way that when you look at it, you will see that these teeth have points on them. And that explains why you will see 3 different kinds of count wheels. You'll see smooth rim count wheel with deep slots. As a variation, you will see count wheel with regular teeth on it, and then you know it is not fixed. If you see a smooth count wheel with deep slots, you know it's a count wheel fixed on one of the arbors in the train. If you see it's got regular teeth on it, you know it's being driven by a regular pinion. And if you see it's got pointed teeth on it, then you know it is being driven by 1 or sometimes even 2 of these trundle wires on a lantern pinion in the next wheel higher. And I think the clock that I brought in happens to have a few of these variations. Take a look at it later. But chances are you realize that. So that explains why there are 3 different kinds of count wheels. Okay, those are 2 of the variations. And I will tell you about the 3rd variation that is extremely common. Even though many of the books I have read do not mention it, and they do not certainly mention it in this relationship. This mechanism has a weak spot in it. The weak spot is right over here. When the count wheel hook, when the locking cam hook drops into the locking cam slot, it goes whack against the front edge of that locking cam. And it does that every hour, sometimes twice an hour, 24 times a day. After week, month, year, decade, generations, century, in somewhere along the line, you can be sure that that whacking that's taking place against this front edge, you're going to get a little bump, a little dent at this spot over there. And if you get a little dent over there, and realizing that this is on the powertrain and being turned counterclockwise from as you look at it, nothing under the sun is going to be able to unlock that train. That will happen in time. So again, smart clockmaker or clockmakers independently or when they had meetings, I doubt if it's that way, decided, hey, we've got higher wheels in this train. Let's lock this train on a higher wheel. What difference will that make? Well, less turning force, less possibility of causing a dent. So let me show you this variation, which occurs in many clocks, and many of the books don't even mention it. Locking the train not on a locking cam slot, but on a wheel higher in the train. So I am going to add, since it's going to do locking, I'm going to add what I will call primary locking. I heard the term used a long time ago. It seems like a good thing to call it. So I will call it, this clock now has primary locking. The train is being locked not on the locking cam, if it were there or isn't there, but it's being locked. In this case, you see I'm locking it on the warning pin. There are clocks that are locked on the warning pin, where the locking takes place with this primary locking arm, the same pin as the warning pin. There are a lot of clocks that way. Well, there are a few anyway. More often, that primary locking arm will be locking it on this highest wheel. You see it's the highest wheel, it's the one next to the fly. On the other side of this wheel, there'll be a pin located in such a place that the primary locking arm causes locking over there. That eliminates the danger of this dent occurring over here in time if you don't have this primary locking, as you may know, occurs very often in clocks. And does that change anything? Well, not really. Really doesn't change anything, because look, this comes around the finger, unlock, it puts the warning detent in front of the warning pin, and then unlocks the train. And when the train is unlocked, this comes around, it's locked by the warning detent, this moves over. Everything happens. The only thing that's been added has been a primary locking arm to the counting locking assembly. What change does take place is this. It makes a change in the function of the count wheel. What it does, I think you can see that if there are teeth over here, even without this primary locking arm, as this train may run, this moves this far, this comes around, and it drops into the shallow slot. Notice, if the count wheel hook drops into a shallow slot, the locking still won't take place because it can't drop down far enough. It has to drop into a deep slot. And what happens then, the locking cam will lift the count wheel hook out of this shallow slot, and the clock will continue to run and strike. It'll happen again, and it doesn't stop there. It doesn't lock, but it will lift the hook out of there, and you will see this characteristic rising and falling of the count wheel hook as the train runs. You see that in many clocks. What has happened simply, and it may not even bother to think about it, but perhaps it does, is that when you have a tooth count wheel, you are endowing the locking cam with a second function. I told you originally all it did was lock the train. But if you have a tooth count wheel, it has a second function. It keeps the count wheel hook from getting caught against the front of these teeth over here. It lifts it up out of the shallow slots. And I don't have to tell you, one of the most irritating and annoying errors in count wheel striking is this count wheel hook getting caught in there. This isn't functioning. When the distance and knowing what parts do what jobs, you will understand that if this, in the course of running, does get stuck against the front and bend or looks like it's going to do damage, or perhaps it's done damage already, what you must do is adjust the distance between these two arms that have gotten a little bit distorted, so that when the count wheel hook is in a deep slot, locking safely takes place, okay? You know how to, you adjust for that. And when the count wheel hook is in the shallow slot, it does not lock. It allows it to continue. And when the locking cam hook is on the rim of the locking cam, it clears the teeth in the count wheel. This is the approach that you use in adjusting these damn wires when they get bent. You knowing what the functions are of the parts. Something isn't working, you go to the part that's responsible and make that necessary adjustment. Okay, now we've done those are the principal variations, and there aren't any more. The only thing I have to add now is half-hour striking. I haven't told you about half-hour striking. You take a couple of minutes, and I'll be through with this, really. Maybe we get to look at that. I can't wait. Wait till I tell you about it. Oh, you won't believe me. Where was it? Yes. Half-hour strike. Oh, one point I want to make. Yes. If it happens to be, if you have primary locking, this is what I want to point out. If you have primary locking, do you still need the locking cam? I said, yes. You need it if you have a tooth count wheel because it keeps that. Okay, somebody must be thinking, all right, wise guy, suppose you have a smooth count wheel here. You don't need the locking cam. You really don't. A lot of American clocks do not have locking cams, in spite of what you may have heard. If you have a smooth count wheel, smooth rim count wheel, you don't need the locking cam for that second function. The locking is taking place on primary locking. Also, so surprisingly, in spite of the fact that you don't need the locking cam, if this is a smooth count wheel, more often than not, I think you'll see it as though it was easier to leave it there than to take it out. All right, half-hour strike. There are two ways that half-hour strike takes place in count wheel striking mechanism. One is so simple, you will wonder why they bother with a more complicated method of doing it, but I will tell you why, and then you'll understand. Let me show you the simple way of adding half-hour striking to any clock you've got. You've got a timepiece, whatever you want. I'll show you how simply you can add half-hour strike if you have count wheel striking. All you need to do is just one thing. Add a second tail to the hammer assembly. And I'm going to do that. You add it to the hammer assembly, and it is shaped in such a manner that when the minute hand comes around to the 6, see what happens? It lifts that second hand